That's sort of a theme song for book lunch. And that's what we're doing now. We're doing the book lunch. I hope the audio is okay. I've been testing it all day. Is it sound okay? Is it clear? Some things are a little bit more important than other things. And of course, audio and picture are important in shows like this. And thank you. That's important. It occurs to me that this is episode 6, and so we are continuing with Hannah Arendt's Life of the Mind. This is Hannah Arendt again, and I'd say 1972, roughly, when she was writing this book, which was in the final manuscript for Mary McCarthy to edit, was in the typewriter just weeks before her passing, and she had not done judging yet, and so we're in Willing, and I want to say a couple things up front before we dive into my usual close reading, which hopefully will be in evidence today. I want to say a note that I have a note of I guess you could call it gratitude, because it's as I said last week, I'm approaching this book lunch series, this series of episodes on Life of the Mind by Hannah Arendt, in the context where I'm right on the edge, personally. Right, I'm not at my limits, but I'm close to my limits, because I did this concert and I'm compiling editing. I'm finishing up a book for Wendy Steiner's latest book. I have many projects. I have writing, so I have a lot of things I'm doing. So I'm right, pretty much, I would say, not at the limit, but adjacent to the limits of my capacities. So, which is kind of, it's interesting. I haven't really thought a lot about this question. And of course, in the context of a show like this, I'm not going to go on and on and on about, hopefully, about my personal character and temperament and life experience, only when it's, as they say, absolutely necessary. But this kind of a characteristic, I don't know yet if being adjacent to that, or being, let's call it fullness of productivity or output. I don't know yet whether it's ideal or not. It's just what I'm doing now. At other times in my life, I was doing different kinds of things and working at a different kind of pace. A lot of it has to do with this show, of course. And the other thing too, which I want to say more generally before we go into this book, is that we're just going to have one more episode on this book. Episode 7 will conclude Life of the Mind, and I'm going to miss it. I'm going to miss her. I'm going to miss it, the book, terribly. I'm going to miss this kind of discussion. And so I want to create a little bit of anticipation in all of you folks out there, and say that in my last episode, I'm going to bring in a little bit, not too much, just a little bit, of visual information. So video documentation, film documentation. I had been promising a long time to show scenes from Margaret von Trotte's Hannah Arendt, her, was it 2007 film, 2006, somewhere in there. And also possibly some clips of Mary McCarthy herself, the editor, because there's some great stuff on YouTube when she was on the Dick Cavett show. And I don't want to say too much about it, but I'm going to play a little bit of that, kind of like a fun, closing or conclusion of this series. And also, of course, in my last episode, I'm going to go to her, that is Hannah Arendt's conclusion. So we've been talking about many things. We've been talking about close reading. We've been talking about the mind. We've been talking about the 2 in 1 as described by Hannah Arendt. And then we talked about tone a lot last week. And I made the observation that it's precisely because of Arendt's tone in prose, not tone in oration and not tone in dance or and not poetry, but tone in prose, that makes her who she is and makes her worthy of our attention. So this is a great book. This is the one in that loose, much contested category. And so that's where we are, and that's where she is. And so we're going to talk more about her tone. And we're also, I should say that what we're going to tackle today is rubs up against if they are boundaries, well, they're crude, sort of necessary, but nevertheless, of course, I would say they're crude, that they're necessary, but incomplete or misleading boundaries. That is between theology and philosophy, intellectual history, religious history. So that's all going to come up because she is doing this, I would call the survey quality of her book. So the first thing she talks about in this regard, and we're in, see where we are here, the discovery of the inner man. That's this book 2 here. Chapter 2. And she has a survey quality. So she's covering, and she's also, interestingly enough, she's covering in a very, it's temporally accurate. In other words, she discusses Paul, St. Paul, formerly known as Saul, right? Paul, so the Apostle Paul, epistles to the Romans, first, right? Well, hold on. Well, she has some of the ancient antiquity folks there, of course, before that. And then she said, we're going to cover a little bit, some more than others today. Paul, Epictetus, which is Stoicism, which we're going to discuss her tone because it's very amusing to be reading Arendt's discussion and commentary of Stoicism and Epictetus today in 2024, when there are millions of people who want to be Stoics and think they can be Stoics and herald Stoicism as a worthy philosophy or religion to follow. And it's very refreshing to read Arendt, because Arendt, as we'll see, one of the things she covers is for her the triteness of some of these nevertheless very good self-help oriented observations that Epictetus and company created that have dominated our popular culture today. And so that's interesting. And so then she goes, after Epictetus, her all-time favorite, more than mine, I should say, although I do like him and sometimes love him, sometimes hate him and shake my fist at him, Augustine, which she did her PhD thesis on, Augustine and love. And so that's why there's so much attention paid to Augustine. So because there's this, and then of course Duns Scotus, who's the High Middle Ages theologian, loves Scotus. That's a whole, so this is sort of, you might say, this episode of our series is the kind of the history of religion, history of thought, survey course episode. So I'll try to make that interesting, not be too much of a history 101 or a theology 101, a history of religion 101. So it's fun, to deal with her prose, and we're going to do that now. I'm just going to have pick out something. She's discussing Paul. Bear with me. Paul, she says, and this is the very heading of this section. So she announces what she thinks Paul is doing. The Apostle Paul and the impotence of the will. So we're discovering that there's this thing called the will. It's a real thing. In other words, people make choices. They not only make choices, they deliberate before they make the choice. In other words, they have an inner life. We're not automatons. Neither then and even not now, although some of our authority figures very much want us to be as automatons, of course, and or actually have designed a world in that way. But putting all that, notwithstanding all of those inconvenient truths, we can realize that we have an inner life. So, but she says something really, really interesting. And this is all I'm going to read from her Paul section because it's so interesting, because it's such vintage Arendt. So here we go. Paul knew how easy it would be to infer from his presentation that we are, in quotes, to continue in sin that grace may abound, unquote. Romans 6:1. And then quote again, quote, why not do evil that good may come, as some people slanderously charge us with saying, Romans 3:81. We're in the Bible now, so I'm going to get out my glasses. I've only started wearing glasses in the past year. And so since I spent 53 years of my life not thinking about glasses, it's not second nature to me yet. But I'm going to get in the habit. It's a good habit to have, so I can look like this and put these on and read about St. Paul and the Bible. And maybe wishing perhaps this episode were tomorrow, which would be Sunday and not today, but here we are. Or tonight, right? So Romans 3:38, although he, Paul, hardly foresaw how much discipline and rigidity of dogma would be required to protect the church against the pecca fortiter. So this is her throwing around her Latin. Pecca fortiter. It's a Latin phrase. He was also quite aware of the greatest stumbling block for a Christian philosophy. Philosophy is italicized. The obvious contradiction between an all-knowing, all-powerful God and what Augustine, she loves Augustine, she can't wait to get to him. She has to include him here, which is discussing Paul. And what Augustine later called the monstrosity of the will. So for the Apostle Paul, the will, and just to interrupt yet again, the upshot of this section is that for Paul, the will is divided. So its impetus is caused by this, I should say these are just beliefs that I don't share. Of course I share the conviction that there is a will, but what I reject is all the specificity, that it's this and it's that, and that we're flesh and spirit and all this, and flesh versus spirit, and all that stuff is stuff that Paul, and then to later Augustine believes in, but they do different things with it. I just wanted to give us the context of what, so that's what causes a kind of impotence. And it goes on. These are questions that Christians would ask, right? How can God permit this human wretchedness? Above all, how can he, quote, still find fault, unquote, since no one, quote, can resist his will, unquote. Romans 9:19. We're here finally in a section that's Martian from extraterrestrial life comes in and said, Mitch, what's Hannah Arendt write like? Here we go. Paul was a Roman citizen, spoke and wrote Koine Greek, K-O-I-N-E, is a kind of Greek, Koine Greek, and was obviously well informed about Roman law and Greek thought. I'm going to pause yet again and comment and close reading on that. So she's saying that this dude, Paul, became a saint, was not just a Christian or a new Christian or a convert and writing to the Romans, and etc. He also was extraordinarily educated. He knew all the languages. He knew Greek. He knew Rome. He read all that. He had read and absorbed all thought and ideas, more or less, prior to both Judaism and Christianity. So he was to use an anachronistic word that I used last time we got together, he is, even though he's part of a religion that's well, now it's almost completely anti-intellectual, but at least had anti-intellectual tendencies even that time. He's pro-intellectual, right? As I am, as Arendt is, right? But he's, and so he's well informed about Roman law, Greek thought. Yet, the founder of the Christian religion, if not the church, remained a Jew. And there could perhaps be no more forceful proof of it than his answer to the unanswerable questions his new faith and the new discoveries of his own inwardness had raised. And she goes on to say, it is almost word for word the answer Job, Job's answer, discussion with God in the Bible, Job, gave, right, when Job was led to question the inscrutable ways of the Hebrew God like Job's. Paul's reply is very simple and entirely unphilosophical. And I won't try to do a voice or anything, but this is Paul speaking. But who are you, a man, to answer back to God? Well, what does molded say to its molder? Well, why have you made me thus? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for beauty and another for menial use? What if God, desiring to make known his power, has endured the vessels of wrath made for destruction, in order to make known the riches of his glory for the vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory? And that's from, if you know your Bible, Romans 9:20, 23, and then in Job 10. In the same vein, God, cutting off all interrogation, had spoken to Job, who had dared to question him. I will question you, and you shall declare to me, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Shall a thought finder contend with the Almighty? Unquote. And to this there exists indeed only Job's answer. Job, I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Unquote. And if you Bible sheet, Job 42:3. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Like a faint echo of this faithful awe before the mystery of all being. Being is capitalized, capital B-E-I-N-G, being. This is the Heidegger in Arendt. This is the Karl Jaspers in Arendt. This is the whole continental tradition. As I said, in the continental tradition, you talk about things like being and absence and presence, But this is the style here, right? Being. Centuries later, we hear Augustine repeating what must have been a well-known joke at the time. And here's the joke. I answer the man who says, what did God do before he made heaven and earth? Well, he was preparing hell for those who pry into such deep matters. That's sort of a joke there. We're supposed to don't ask too many questions. That's the anti-intellectual dimension to this tradition, which is there. On the other hand, as I've said, my favorite philosopher, one of my favorite philosophers, Bernard Williams, has a wonderful phrase that he came up with called one thought too many. And the sort of cheap pop vogue word for that is overthink that people use today. One thought too many. I think Bernard Williams' example is the very most obvious example of, people typically don't go throughout their day unless they're, really deeply, I guess, poor and oppressed, in which they do have to have this thought. They don't think about the right not to be killed, for example. It's just or things like that. It's kind of one thought too many. Excuse me. So he made hell for those who thought too much. But Augustine did not let the matter rest at that. Several chapters further on in the Confessions, and again, great books, read the Confessions, just like Hannah Arendt or good stuff. In the Confessions, after denouncing unjokingly those who ask such questions as men attacked by, quote, by a criminal disease that makes them thirst for more than they can hold, unquote. Gives the logically correct and existentially unsatisfactory answer that since the creator / God, that's capitalized, creator God, is eternal, he must have created time when he created heaven and earth so that there could be no before prior to the creation. Quote, let them see that there could be no time without a created being, unquote. So that's a little taste of Hannah Arendt, not a, in any, at least conventional sense, religious or spiritual thinker. In those passages, showing her chops. So she's showing her immense knowledge of not just Judaism, the Judaism in which she was raised, but also Christianity and many other things. And so she's a little bit, what I've been trying to say is that kind of, it's, I don't want to say showing off, but her chops or her virtuosity of these kinds of, her knowledge, deep knowledge of these things, but also that she thinks it matters. So, I mean, she's mentioning all this because, you know, it helps what she's trying to do. And so then we go to Epictetus, and as I said earlier, Epictetus is fashionable now. If you've seen A Man in Full, the Netflix series with Jeff Daniels, it's based on a Tom Wolfe novel that I had occasion to read in the 90s. I had a first edition of that. That's a whole rabbit hole of another discussion about Tom Wolfe and Tom Wolfe's clothes and how he dressed and my dress. I can go on. I don't want to get too far afield, but you know, in the novel form of that, one of the main characters, well, you know, the Jeff Daniels character, this guy that runs Atlanta, this sort of billionaire class business person, befriends a person who's unjustly imprisoned, and they get into Epictetus, and they go on the road preaching Epictetus. And so, you know, this is kind of the thing. And that was way back in the early to mid 90s. So some things, you know, that's of course a work of fiction. Characters in work of fiction, but I want to again, I'm gonna do close observations of little sections rather than whole sections, you know, rather than a whole, you know. So Epictetus, he was primarily a teacher, and since he taught and did not write, he apparently thought of himself as a follower of Socrates, forgetting, like most of Socrates' followers, that Socrates had nothing to teach. And then there's, you know, the thing, the art of living one's life, right, in quotes. That became, I think, didn't that become trademarked or something by one secular religious group or another today? I don't know. Probably. This art consisted mainly in having an argument ready for every emergency, for every situation of acute misery. And she goes on later to say, thus happiness, the concept happiness, the state of mind of happiness. I'm always reminded of Nietzsche's wonderful phrase that people don't want happiness, only the English, the British want happiness. I think that's a famous joke from Nietzsche. Thus, happiness changed its meaning. It was no longer understood as eudaimonia. It's E-U-D-A-I-M-O-N-I-A. Eudaimonia, this word that has to do with a kind of a well-balanced, even keel, sort of the good life, right? Living well, but as, some more words here, Euria biou, so E-U-R-O-I-A B-I-O-U. And this, according to Hannah Arendt, is a Stoic metaphor indicating a free-flowing life, undisturbed by storms, tempests, or obstacles. Its characteristics were serenity, the stillness after the storm, and tranquility, fair weather. Metaphors unknown to classical antiquity. So she's saying that Epictetus, and mainly him, but also the Stoical school, such as it was so, I guess, revolutionary, if you want to put it that way, that they changed the definition of happiness. Again, in an earlier school of thought, long before them, people thought happiness was one thing, maybe, and so this is a, we can sometimes underestimate these changes through time, which brings us, of course, to the notion of discontinuity of belief through time. She goes on, they all relate to a mood of the soul that is best described in negative terms. And she, like ataraxia, another Greek word, Ataraxia, ataraxia, and indeed consists of something wholly negative. To be happy now meant primarily not to be miserable. So if you're not miserable and suffering, you are happy, I guess, something like that. I'm going to skip ahead more because she does this Arendt's tone. Okay, here it's in full flower in this passage. Okay, once reason has discovered this inward region, again, this inward region's real, it's important. For St. Paul, it was a mess and divisive and divided and needs to be overcome, I guess, through some kind of faith, right? Epictetus, is working with a different way. Inward region, where man is confronted only by the impressions outward things make on his mind, rather than by their factual existence, its task has been accomplished. The philosopher is no longer the thinker examining what may come his way. No, not supposed to do that. You don't examine what comes your way. But the man who has trained himself never to turn to outward things, no matter where he appears to be. And this is a very, very popular view. The idea that the things that you can change are the things versus things you cannot, knowing the difference, and also not responding emotionally to things in the world. Now, I should say, and I hope I am not a Stoic in any way, shape, or form. Partly because I'm a pluralist, and Stoicism is a form of monism. Even though I'm sure many Stoics would say, I'm not, who you calling a monist? I'm not. It is, because it's saying there's something we're supposed to be doing, and that we know what that is. And just notwithstanding the fact that there are millions of people in the world, tens of millions, billions, I don't know, people, all walking around, and I would say that all those people have different dispositions and different reactions to external stimuli. And, people have to find out what works for them. And of course, if they find Stoicism to work for them, I'm going to certainly respect that, even while saying that I don't think it's something everybody should do, or, now, my last statement on the matter, can do, which is a kind of an irony considering Stoicism's teaching, the irony that maybe you can't be stoical, right? If it's not in your temperament to be so. So there's all these possibilities. So he lets his philosopher go to the games like everybody else. We're going to go see the sport, the football, the gladiators, the whatever, the games. We're going to go see the games. But unlike the vulgar crowd of other spectators, he is concerned there only with himself and his own happiness. Hence, he forces himself to wish only that to happen, which does happen. Right? And only to win who does win. So it's a sort of accepting what happens. It's a form of self-therapy, right? It's a form of management. A very early form of that. Epictetus' discovery was that the mind, because it could retain outward impressions, was able to deal with all outside things as mere data of consciousness, as the impressions imprinted on the mind. Looking at a table does not enable us to decide whether the table is good or bad. Vision does not tell us, nor do any of our other senses. Here we go. A little more Arendt tone in this passage. Epictetus gives many examples which we do not need to enumerate here. They make tedious reading, like exercises in a school book. So I just want to stop there because she's, from the point of view of 1972, these things she's discussing were to her cliches and not worth, dwelling on. As we, of course, know from the point of view of 2024, and they are not only, they need to be beaten into our heads and repeated all the time, and you will write a best-selling book with those cliched over, what we call overworn out use things. So it's interesting sort of time, but we're in 1972 now. We're reading. She says it makes for tedious reading. The upshot is always the same. What bothers men is not what actually happens to them, but their own judgment of the thing that happens, right? You will be harmed only when you think you are harmed. No one can harm you without your consent. For instance, what does it mean to be slandered? Stand by a stone and slander it. What effect will you produce? Be stone-like and you will be invulnerable. And so this is for a philosophy of total world alienation. That's Arendt's phrase. She loves to discuss whether a people, plural, collective, or individual, is world denying or world embracing. And of course, there's much continuum in between these, between the hermit or the outcast and the rock star successful politician. Or there's many gradations in between, world embracing and world denying. But she says Stoicism is world denying, of course. For a philosophy of total world alienation, there is much truth in the remarkable sentence with which Camus began his first book, The Myth of Sisyphus. Albert Camus, the only philosophical problem is the question of suicide. Il n'y a qu'un problème philosophique vraiment sérieux, c'est le suicide. My French is not great, but there you go. I love Camus. Camus is one of the few French people to call out, in that time, to call out Stalinist bullshit in the Soviet Union's crap. Some of the best minds of that era were hoodwinked into Marxist-Leninism and Stalinism in the 50s. And Albert Camus said, no, not going along with that. He's an angel for that. Not many. I could say more, but I won't. But I mean, you asking which Camus book to read? I don't know. The Rebel's good. This Sisyphus, Myth of Sisyphus, is good. The Stranger, which I think I quoted it. Remember, I was talking about the tone of Camus. Mother died today, or maybe was it yesterday that she died? I don't remember that opening. Shocking, scandalous opening for a novel in the 50s, right? At first glance, this doctrine of invulnerability and apathy, how to shield yourself against reality, how to lose your ability to be affected by it, for better, for worse, in joy or in sorrow, seems so obviously open to refutation that the enormous argumentative as well as emotional influence of Stoicism on some of the best minds of Western mankind seems well nigh incomprehensible. In Augustine, we find such a refutation in its shortest and most plausible form. And here we're getting close to her. We're not in the Augustine section, but she's such a good writer. She sets up her book so that the next chapter is on Augustine, sections on Augustine. And, a few pages before, she's already starting to quote Augustine. Sort of like, it's like when you compose a piece of music, a theme develops and you introduce the theme. It's good. All right. In Augustine, we find such a refutation in its shortest and most plausible form. The Stoics, he says, have found the trick of how to pretend to be happy. And then she quotes Augustine, since a man cannot get what he wants what he can get. Moreover, Augustine goes on, the Stoics assume that all men by nature wish to be happy, but they do not believe in immortality, at least not in bodily resurrection. That is, not in a future deathless life. And this is a contradiction in terms. And again, that's what Augustine thinks, because Augustine is a certain kind of Christian, and he introduces, for what an interesting life. So he had that affair with the woman, and he gave up teaching rhetoric to preach, which for me, in my book, he loses points, because I'd much rather, that's what I'm doing in this. I'm not, you notice I'm not preaching, we're teaching rhetoric here. I'm doing the very thing that Augustine says we're supposed to give up for something better, which might connect anachronistically later on to Kierkegaard's, aesthetic man, ethical man, religious man, his stations of his levels there. But that's fine now for Epictetus. It's fun to read. It's fun to read again Arendt writing about something and not treating it as sacred or as truth. And maybe that was possible in 72. I don't know. Now in number 10, she says, Augustine, the first philosopher of the will. And let's take a moment here to join Hannah Arendt in her commencement speech type. Well, it's not, that's unfair. It's not quite that. It's a little more sophisticated than that, but it's a little bit like great books kind of stuff of Augustine. Okay, she says, Augustine, the first Christian philosopher, and one is tempted to add the only philosopher the Romans ever had, was also the first man of thought who turned to religion because of philosophical perplexities. So she says that all those other folks in Rome, they weren't philosophers. Augustine was a philosopher. That's a bold statement. And there's even a footnote here. I actually read the footnote. She says, there's a scholar that says that he was one of the main great Roman thinkers among them. He wasn't, but he says he's more, what did she say? He's more circumspect or more cautious than I am. Hannah Arendt's not cautious. She says, this is the man she fell in love with. His thought, doing the PhD on him. So that's understandable, right? Like many educated people of the time, he had been brought up as a Christian, yet what he himself eventually described as a conversion, the subject matter of his Confessions, the book, The Confessions, some think the very first memoir, the very first autobiography. That in itself is interesting. If we had the time, we would do a whole series on Rousseau's Confessions. If I had time, what books would I choose? I would choose Augustine, Rousseau. Maybe I would choose Girl Interrupted. I don't know. I would span different. There's so many. The American Childhood. Well, I should say now that I'm thinking of it, our next book is going to be Annie Dillard's American Childhood. Not just because I had that interruption in our last session where I said, well, what if we were doing Annie Dillard? Well, our next book, you heard it here first, will be in American Childhood. So that's gonna be the next book we'll do. So if that interests you. So get anybody ready. Yeah. Conversion. I interrupted her sentence. I apologize. Like man, educate people at the time, brought up as a Christian. He himself basically described as conversion, the subject matter of his confession, blah, 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 blah. Augustine was utterly different from the experience that changed the extremely zealous Pharisee Saul into Paul, the Christian apostle and follower of Jesus of Nazareth. Just looking here, seeing what to read. There is no doubt that Augustine belongs among the great and original thinkers. Again, more praise. But he was not a systematic thinker. And it is true that the main body of his work is littered with lines of thought that are not worked through to the conclusion, and with abandoned literary enterprises. Besides being shot through with repetitions, what is remarkable under the circumstances is the continuity of the chief topics that finally, at the end of his life, he subjected to a searching examination titled recantations, as though the bishop and the prince of the church were his own inquisitor. Perhaps the most crucial of these ever-recurring topics was and here it goes, this is, again, remember I said this is the most debated, most discussed topic in all of philosophy, popular media, popular culture, the degree in which those latter areas of life even approach the intellectual, they usually don't. Free choice of the will. There it is. As a faculty distinct from desire and reason. Let's sit on that. So Augustine's saying, Arendt's saying that Augustine is saying there is this, not only is there a thing called the will, but there's a free choice in the matter of the will. Not only that, but it doesn't have anything to do with either reason or desire. It's something else. It's neither reason or desire. See, this is the thing about this tradition of thought. Arendt's in this tradition, and again, it's anachronistic to talk about Augustine as part of that tradition because it's not before there is a continent or Anglo-America or any of that. It's thousands of years before any of that, right? And yet, there's an embryonic step here of a beginning of what we can call continental. And as I've said in all these episodes, folks in that tradition talk about being, and they may talk about spirit. And they may, with Hegel, talk about world spirit. And they may talk about an oversoul. They may talk about this. They may talk about that there's a free choice of the will that's neither desire nor reason. And that, again, is to, way of greatest point of contrast, scientific scholarship, Anglo-American, British sort of laboratory-oriented empiricism, where you take a word like reason or take a word like desire and you try to look in the brain or do neurobiological studies. You try to say, well, this is what we've determined by testing you, the subject, that you had desire at 2:30 for such and such. And we determined that at 2:45, you put aside your desire, we can see in your brain, and you exercised your reason to not act upon your desire. And we gave you a whole printout, computer printout of that story of what you're doing and all your decision making, in the manner of a Benjamin Libet, if you know that name. There's so many. Herbert Simon, actually the origin of algorithms and AI, again. That's what I'm trying to get us to see, is that whole milieu of thinking about us that way is predicated on certain assumptions. Namely, that reason, like desire and like will, are things like this piano bench that end at a certain point and that begin at a certain point and that are describable and knowable in a way like you define the equator, or something. And that, I have to say, and this is where I'm biased only in this way, I should say, because I love English. I love Stuart Hampshire and Bernard Williams and Isaiah Berlin and so many English, British thinkers who, again, I want to be clear, but this is the one area in which I have to put my hat in with the continental cats, with the French and the Germans and with the Foucaults and the Derridas and the, et cetera, Merleau-Ponty and the Albert Camus, because they don't think that life is quantifiable like that in the last instance, and solid like that in the last instance. And in that sense, that's not really real in the same way that this I'm doing this on the piano, playing those chords. Right? So they don't see reason, desire, and choice that way. All the while respecting and acknowledging that nevertheless reason and choice are still real things in the world. And then this gets to my earlier comments about the problem. I'm making this up. The problem of too much specificity. This is the problem with most of our world religions now, and certainly our politics. My God, we're drowning in specificity. It's interesting, the specificity of, and this is what leads many people to open up Augustine. They read Augustine and I can imagine a reader unlike myself, another kind of reader, saying, well, this is kind of boring. It's a waste of my time because Augustine is not telling me what anything is. Or another kind of reader who's like a believing Christian in the kind of Christianity to which I personally don't really subscribe, but would open him to find out how to live and what to do. Now, there's a lot of that in Augustine. It's the worst part of Augustine. I mean, it's the part that to me is the least interesting. It's not only that it's dated, it's that it's, again, monistic, right? And, he'll give them plenty to read there, and there's a lot to do if they want to pursue that path. I'm sure that the way Augustine is taught at Notre Dame University, or Calvin College in Michigan or something, or Roberts University, or heaven help us, any of those. I'm sure it's going to be taught a certain way. And I'm sure it's going to be taught, Augustine's not going to be taught as a beautiful poet, which is how I look at him, actually. As he's like Beethoven and Mozart or Art Tatum or Miles Davis. No, he's going to be taught as, did the guy get it right or not? Should we follow him or not? It's going to be taught that way. And that's that's the world we're in, So this is just gotta power for the course. So I'm having fun a little bit here, but it was a brief interlude where I ranted. To summarize, this will of Augustine's, which is not understood as a separate faculty, but in its function within the mind as a whole, where all single faculties, memory, intellect, and will, are mutually referred to each other, finds its redemption in being transformed into love. Love as a kind of enduring and conflictless will. So love is will. They're both, love's capitalized, will is capitalized. Love is will. And it has an obvious resemblance to Mill. Goodness, is she talking about John Stuart Mill? See, this is a problem when you skip around. Maybe she is. Well, Mill also wrote the autobiography of John Stuart Mill. I would include that in my great personal writing books seminar, probably, would include that. Education of Henry Adams, I don't know. Stop, Mitch. I gotta stick to the thing here. Yeah, Mill's enduring eye, which finally prevails in the will's decisions. Augustine's love exerts its influence through the weight. The will resembles a weight. That's Augustine's phrase there. Remember I talked about in my aesthetic series, volume and mass, heaviness. It's like there's a kind of it's a spiritual weight, right? It's a weight. It adds to the soul, thus arresting its fluctuations. Men do not become just by knowing what is just, but by loving justice. Love is the soul's gravity. Or the other way around, quoting Augustine yet again, the specific gravity of bodies is, as it were, their love. That's a new, so what Augustine is doing there is a new kind of, it's a new kind of writing, and it's a new kind of way of talking about things. Looked in that way, Augustine is sort of like a Miles Davis, you know? He's a cat that's coming in and saying, well, let's try to write about these things and see these things in an utterly different way. The same way when you hear, if you hear a Miles Davis, I mean, I can't really do it on the piano, but yeah, I'm just making stuff up. I don't know what I'm doing, but you know, maybe his tone with the mute, Miles Davis, and people would hear that and they would say, "Well, what the? Who makes the horn sound like that?" Booyah! You know, it's, you know, again, everybody else, and again, the Clifford Browns and the Dizzy Gillespies, and they're playing trumpet too. It doesn't sound like this. A different thing. You know, and that's a difference in styles, and that's the reason why I bring this up. Is the difference. These are profound differences within a single style. They're all using the same modes and the same chords, and they're you know, and yet they're doing utterly original things. And Augustine is doing something original with his own kind of Christianity, if I can put it that way. And you're certainly welcome to reject it, not believe in it, not follow it. And you're certainly welcome to, like your host here, and Hannah Arendt, to find it utterly fascinating and always relevant. So, you know, you can choose that too. You know, those are choices to be made. And you can tell that she spent all this time. I mean, again, this is also just connecting the end of Hannah Arendt's life with her girlhood. So, last years of her life with her back in the 20s when she was working on that paper, Augustine in Love. I'm going to read a little bit more, which this is Arendt, and then quoting Augustine. The mind performs this temporalizing action in each everyday act. Quote, Augustine, I'm about to recite a psalm. The life of this action of mine is distended into memory in respect to the part I have already recited, and into expectation in respect to the part I'm about to recite. Attention is present, through which what was future is conveyed over, that it may become past, unquote. That's a mouthful, that Augustine. It has to do with the process of doing things in time. Reciting something. Attention, this is Arendt, attention, as we have seen, is one of the major functions of the will, the great unifier, which here, in what Augustine calls the distension of the mind, binds together the tenses of time into the present. So she's back to attention. We talked a couple episodes ago about that French philosopher who had a theory about time and attention. Very interesting. I think, yeah, there was patience. What do you feel by reading extraordinary books? That's a question. It says lay scientific clarity. Well, you mean, why am I reading this now? Or what do I feel? Feeling, you know, it makes you feel good. I could feel that a human did this. And then I could feel that maybe I could do something going forward, something equally interesting, hopefully, or at least, even if it doesn't end up, the same, the sheer doing of it, inspired by things like this, is its own reward. Is that, I don't know. It's hard, very difficult. I'm sorry. It's hard to, that's the best articulation I can put. And we haven't even got to Duns Scotus. I don't know if we can. And then she goes on to say that, Augustine's refuting cyclical, the cyclical, it's the pagan cyclical view. Timothy Snyder has a really interesting theory about all these. Again, I'm entering topical themes, so trigger warning alert. I'm going to be discussing current events. Timothy Snyder feels that there's a neo-pagan, specifically anti-Judeo-Christian dimension to the Putins and the Trumps of the world and the conspiracy theories about events of the day. And he has it's a very difficult lecture. You can find it as one of his recent lectures. And I guess he's using that word to mean blind obedience to what appears in your feed. Just stuff in the feed that you read and that you emotionally have a reaction to. Almost, he says it's like an oracle. That was his metaphor. And he finds that, again, he's not trying to be denominational. He's not saying that. He finds that, he finds that in violation of certain Judeo-Christian concepts. So in a sense, even though some of the people doing this will tell you they are Christian, or they are this, or they are that, or they're following Peter the Great, or following Vladimir Lenin, or heaven help us, who knows, right? God help us. But that the actual practice has, let me put it, some of the negative aspects of pagan life, the very things, right? The very things Christ was inveighing against, the very practices. I don't want to list what those practices are. Some of them are quite barbaric, right? At the same time, there's many valuable things whether it's astrology or the tarot. So again, it's tricky, to evaluate, and that's why I always say I feel like I'm at a cafeteria. You don't pick everything and I don't think in the cafeteria. It's been what has it been, 10 years since I've been in a cafeteria? I don't know, but, taking it as a metaphor for, I'm a cafeteria adult student. So that's another answer to lay scientific clarity that, I'm trying to figure out what the best choice is in the cafeteria, but I think Timothy Snyder and Ann Applebaum, those two, of course, they know each other, but they're both Sovietologists, I think, if that's the term. So they know the history of those countries. They both have really interesting theories about that. And again, I'm very cautious. I try to always avoid getting into topical things like that, unless it's clear cut, unless it's, to me, clear cut of what's right or what's wrong, sort of thing. But I don't know, it's if we go ahead to Thomas Aquinas with the primacy of intellect and Duns Scotus and the primacy of the will. So you see the development, the plot, as it were, of the book. We start with the will is impotent because it's divided. That's St. Paul. Epictetus says there's always the will. You have to deal with it. Here's how best to deal with it. Don't be emotionally influenced by external things, all that. Resign yourself to what is. Augustine and love, right? Thomas Aquinas and the primacy of intellect. Aquinas is the intellectual Christian. As we all know, extraordinarily influential on Catholic, how should I put this? Catholic intellectual history and Catholic intellectual thought, of course. There's the Thomas, you know, Thomas. And so she has a thing here. For Thomas, as for nearly all his successors in philosophy, of whom there were more than avowed Thomists, Thomists, it was a matter of course, actually, the very touchstone of philosophy as a separate discipline, that the universal is nobler and higher in rank than the particular. And the only proof this needed was and remained the old Aristotelian statement that the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. Now that's kind of, that's a worldview in which you look at the overall. Now, I'm more in the postmodern field, so I don't like theories and systems too much, and so I'm not very enamored with the whole or the universal. While accepting that it's real, in other words, I don't think we should take it into account, but I'm not gonna. The particular is awfully interesting, right? I just watched last week Abbas Kiarostami's Taste of Cherry, Iranian filmmaker, an Iranian film. One of the most beautiful films I've ever seen. And it came on Criterion. And it's Iran in the mid-90s. And it's about a man trying to kill himself, riding in a Jeep over the vast desert. And all the people he befriends, old men and teachers. And, because he doesn't want to do the act himself, he's trying to hire people and pay them money to bury his body after he takes poison. Again, I make it sound very morbid. It's the movie that Roger Ebert changed his mind about. I think originally he hated it and panned it, and later on recanted, and people often change their mind about things. I've discussed that with Azar Nafizi on our but I'm only mentioning that because for me, when I'm watching, as I did last week, Taste of Cherry and all its beauty, and for me it's the particularity of this man who these strangers think he's like a hustler, maybe like it's a homoerotic thing. Why is he, going in this car? What the hell is he doing? Only later they realize he doesn't, he's not trying to, anything. It's nothing really like that. It's just he's trying to find a way to kill himself, and he's doing this in the context of a religious tradition and culture that's, I think, against suicide, as so many philosophies and religions are. Going back to Albert Camus' first line of the Myth of Sisyphus, the only real philosophical question is the question of suicide, right? So when I'm watching Taste of Cherry, when he meets the old professor said, my life was suffering. All of our lives have so much suffering. And that professor said, when I tasted the cherry, the fruit from the tree, and when I shook the tree and the cherries came down and I gave the cherries to my family, he says the flavor was so out of this world that, in a sense, for a very long time, the old professor had a change of outlook because of eating this fruit. Right? So when I'm watching that film, I'm thinking about the way this old man looks and him talking about eating cherries and these people entertaining suicide and the sand in the desert and the immense vastness. I mean, to me, is more interesting than David Lean, Zhivago, actually, and much more interesting than The Sheltering Sky of Bernardo Bertolucci. But, you know, that's a particular thing. While nevertheless, there is a universality. Of course, there's a universality to that part of the earth has a desert, and people live in a desert. And part of the earth is, you know, has ocean, right? And there's a kind of, that the earth, and then it's maybe universal to entertain suicide and to universal to be opposed to suicide or not even want to discuss it. Maybe it's universal to not even want to watch a movie like that, like Roger Ebert didn't want to watch it. There's an interview where Kiarostami was wondering, I think Quentin Tarantino voted for his film at Cannes. And Kiarostami was saying, I saw this guy's Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction and Jackie Brown. Why does this guy like my movie? He says, my movie has nothing in common with any of this man's movies. He says, but he supported our film. He loved our film and helped us. Huh? Right? So, interesting, right? So those things interest me. And just like this book interests me. So if I had to pick one thing about Duns Scotus, it's hard, right? I mean, he's we're also discussing a period of time here. So we're moving ahead, right? And we're moving ahead to the 1200s, the later 1200s, and sort of like 1301, I think, is the year of Scotus's death. So that's a different time period. We're moving ahead. I'm just going to find an excerpt here. What is it? This is Hannah Arendt. She's not quoting. This is Arendt. What is it in the human mind that makes it capable of transcending its own limitations, its absolute finitude? And the answer to this question in Scotus, as distinguished from Thomas, again, she's saying Thomas thinks this. This is where Scotus disagrees, right? As distinguished from Thomas, the answer is the will. To be sure, no philosophy can ever be a substitute for divine revelation, which the Christian accepts on the strength of testimony in which he has faith. Creation and resurrection are articles of faith. They cannot be proved or refuted by natural reason. Again, Arendt's taking very seriously here the notion of a state of mind in which one could be utterly indifferent to whether you have proved or refuted something, even by the lights of this natural scientific method. That all of that could be a matter of some indifference to you. It's got a state of mind. Okay. As such they are, here it is, one of the important words in Arendt, she italicizes it, contingent. Contingency. Factual truths whose opposite is not inconceivable. They relate to events that might not have happened. For those brought up in the Christian faith, they have the same validity as other events of which we know only because we trust the testimony of witnesses. For instance, the fact that the world existed before we were born, or that there are places on the earth where we have never been. We all know that, right? There's places we haven't been. There was a world before we got here. Oh, I don't know. I can't speak to that. That's not my. That's outside of. That's not my. I respect that, but I'm not a. Get back to this. So, contingent, or even that certain persons are our parents. The other thing that Scotus makes clear is that the will is autonomous. So we're in the high Middle Ages now. 1270, 1275, that period. And along comes a thinker like Duns Scotus, and Duns Scotus is using the concept of autonomy. That's quite radical in that time, to be autonomous. Interesting. Besides being open to contraries, the will can suspend itself. And while such suspension can only be the result of another volition, in contradistinction to the Nietzschean and Heideggerian will not to will, which we will discuss later. She's got to bring in Nietzsche and her teacher and lover, Martin Heidegger. The second volition, in which indifference is directly chosen, is an important testimony to human freedom, to the mind's ability to avoid all coercive determination from the outside. Let me go ahead push ahead a little bit more. It is because of their freedom that men, though part and parcel of created being, can praise God's creation. For if such praise derived from their reason, it would be no more than a natural reaction caused by our given harmony with all the other parts of the universe. But by the same token, they can also abstain from such praise, and even, and here's Scotus's quote, hate God and find satisfaction in such hatred, unquote, or at least refuse to love him. This refusal, which Scotus does not mention in his discussion of the possible hatred of God, is posited in analogy to his objection to the old all men will to be happy. Remember Nietzsche's joke about not all people want to be happy, just the British do and all that. And what is happiness to say? He admits that, of course, all men by nature wish to be happy, although no agreement about happiness exists. That was, we know that happiness is a thing we kind of all want, but we differ on what the thing actually is. Is happiness, is happiness getting laid? Is happiness having a good life? Is happiness, being an upstanding citizen? Is happiness being moved this way or that by what comes on one's feed in the computer, and swayed this way or that by whatever new nonsense is visited upon us by algorithms? Or is happiness turning all the machines and devices off and being a hermit in a cave, fill in the blank of whatever you think? Is happiness playing the piano? Is happiness reading this book? Okay, you get the point. But the will, of course all men by nature wish to be happy, but the will, and here is the crucial point, can transcend nature, in this case suspended. There is a difference between man's natural inclination to happiness and happiness as the deliberately chosen goal of one's life. It is by no means impossible for man to discount happiness altogether in making his will projects. As far as natural inclination is concerned and the limitation nature sets on the power of the will, all that could be affirmed is that no man can will to be miserable. That's in quotes, will to be miserable. Scotus avoids giving a clear answer to the question of whether hatred of God is possible or not, because of the close relation of that question to the question of evil. We're back to Arendt's old bugbear, an old question of evil, right? And she quotes Scotus, quote, but not without raising some doubts as to the possibility of the opposite view, unquote. The will's autonomy, quote, nothing else but the will is the total cause of volition, unquote, decisively limits the power of reason. So here's will limiting reason. There's this reason has power, but there's this thing called the will, right? Decisively limits the power of reason, whose dictate is not absolute, but it does not limit the power of nature, be it the nature of the inner man called inclinations, or that of exterior circumstances. So Scotus is dealing with all the same material as the Stoics were. How should you react to something? What is it, right? What's the proper reaction or improper, right? And the things I just mentioned now, what will bring you happiness, right? The will's autonomy, nothing else but the total will of cause of volition, whose absolute inclination is the will's money. Okay. To illustrate this mental freedom, Scotus gives the example of a man, quote, who hurls himself from a high place, unquote. Does not this act terminate his freedom since he now necessarily falls? According to Scotus, it does not. So what Scotus is saying there is that the physical inevitability of a thing, the example I always like to use is squeezing a toothpaste with the top off. Squeezing the toothpaste out of a tube of toothpaste. That if you squeeze the tube, something's going to come out, Crest or Colgate or whatever, right? In much the same way as this dude jumps off this building. This reminds me of Don DeLillo's Falling Man novel. I talked about Don DeLillo. September 11th, of course. But, according to Scotus, no. So there's a necessity to the falling, compelled by the law of gravity. That's the realm of necessity, right? The person, the man, remains free to continue to will to fall and can also, of course, change his mind. In which case he would be unable to undo what he started voluntarily and would find himself in the hands of necessity. We remember Spinoza. We've mentioned Spinoza before, a very important Italian Jewish philosopher. She's given an example. Spinoza talks about a rolling stone. A rolling stone gathers no moss, right? Rolling stone. Papa was a rolling stone. The Temptations. Rolling stone. The Rolling Stones. Can't always get what you want, right? The Rolling Stone. Let me get back into this stone, which if endowed with consciousness, as if the stone were conscious, right, would necessarily be prey to the illusion that it had hurled itself and was now rolling of its own free will. Such comparisons are useful in order to realize to what an extent such propositions and their illustrations, disguised in the form of plausible agreements, depend on preliminary assumptions about necessity or freedom as self-evident facts. I'm going to repeat that sentence because it's an Arendtian sentence, if ever there was one. There it is. Such comparisons are useful in order to realize to what an extent such propositions and their illustrations, disguised in the form of plausible arguments, depend on preliminary assumptions about necessity or freedom as self-evident facts. To stay with the present illustration, no law of gravity can have power over the freedom guaranteed in interior experience. There's something in here, interior experience, that's not like gravity, which is again the lie, and it is a lie, of our scientific materialists that wish to make all of human life the same as gravity, or make us into a tube of toothpaste. A tube of toothpaste that you squeeze it and something comes out. There's this, nuance is a good word, actually, yes. There's this wiggle room, to quote the late Dan Dennett. He wrote a book called Wiggle Room, which is his very, not very so good attempt to defend a compatibilist, free will. Look at that. But there is wiggle room, if you will, right? All right. Duns Scotus distinguishes between two kinds of will: natural will, which follows the natural inclinations and may be inspired by reason as well as by desire. So there's this thing called natural will, which has a quality of natural inclination. And yet, even though there's this natural will, it has these two components. It has a reason component, rational, and a desiring. Reason and emotion, reason and desire. Okay, so even that. And then, drum roll, there's this other kind of will, just simply free will, properly speaking. Free will. Goes on to call it freely designs ends which are pursued for their own sake, and of this pursuance only the will is capable. It is with great regret that I admit that this cannot be the place, and that I would not be qualified if it were the place, to do justice to Duns Scotus's originality of thought, especially to the passion for constructive thinking that pervades all of his genuine work, which he had neither the time, he had died too young for a philosopher, nor perhaps the inclination to present systematically. It is hard to think of any great philosopher, any one of the great thinkers, of whom there are not many, who still need so much to be discovered and helped by our attention and understanding. And she goes on to talk about contingency is the price to be paid for freedom. Scotus is the only thinker for whom the word contingent has no derogatory association. And then she quotes the man himself, Scotus himself. Quote, I say that contingency is not merely a privation or defect of being, like the deformity, which is sin, right? Contingency is a positive mode of being, just as necessity is another mode. Yeah, she does talk about John Stuart Mill. I had forgotten. Yeah, the autobiography and the is it Harriet Taylor, his wife? Yeah. And of course, usually in a Politics 101, you read On Liberty. 19th century. I actually have on my bedstand, or whatever it is, I have a copy of Mill on Liberty, so I guess I'll like it. I also have a copy of some other things. I've got the Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Suzuki, personal favorite, and some other things. John Stuart Mill's great contribution is his imagine this idea. He sort of thinks that if you get people together, some of those people are going to be wrong, some of them are going to be right. that if you just allow them all to deliberate, you can make progress eventually. He thinks that in a room talking. In fact, he wrote essentially, he thought that he was optimistic on that score. And he also thought that the alternative of that was people fighting and or censoring, not having any discussion at all. And that's what he thought. So I don't know. In John Stuart Mill's account of his severe, unforgiving father, which has shades of Bleak House, actually, the novel, Dickens' novel, because a lot of John Stuart Mill's journey is escaping the scientific rigidity of his father, I think so. I think that's that. But I don't want to. I think it's time to stop. Even good things come to an end. I hope this was good. I don't know. I do my best. Again, I have a lot of. I always feel like I come up short. I try to discuss these things, and again, as I said, today's subject is a little bit more for a Sunday, perhaps, or it's actually for a Saturday, depending on one's tradition, right? And the next book lunch, we're going to conclude Life of the Mind. Well, thank you, Yvette. It means a lot to hear that, read these comments and scientific clarity. Interesting talking about their life, and really I appreciate all of it. So that'll be our last. And again, we're going to conclude Life of the Mind, episode 7. And then after that, we're going to jump into Annie Dillard. Any thoughts about Annie Dillard, or anybody who's a fan of An American Childhood? It's about people in Pennsylvania growing up in the 50s, I guess, early 60s. I don't know. It'd be good. I look forward to it. I'm glad people are tuning in to Christine Moore. That's our episode, the vocalist. I'm glad also, too, that looking way into the distance, September 1st, I'm going to do a trio concert. I have right now up a solo piano thing that I did last week. So again, I'm close to the limits of my capacities, meaning that's just enough, no more, it'd be too much. So I'm going to have some more of this Think Coffee and say thank you. And thanks for tuning in. And again, I'm going to miss this book. I think we've given it as much time as I think it's as we could, given the context. And I look forward to the Annie Dillard, and I hope you have a great weekend. And maybe your weekend will have some sun in it. We never know. So thank you.